Hello folks, happy Monday. Hope you enjoyed the Hungarian Grand Prix. Perhaps wasn't the most exciting of all the races we've had this year, was it? But as a weekend, I thought it had pretty much everything. It had the rain, of course, which spiced everything up. I said in my preview that the Hungarian Grand Prix should suit the Ferraris in terms of their power levels, their grip levels, their downforce levels, the type of circuit that it was. And on Friday, when the temperatures were up at the sort of predicted high levels that we talked about, it absolutely suited the Ferraris, and it was looking like it was going to be a slam dunk for Sebastian Vettel. They had the performance over the Red Bulls, they had performance over the Mercedes. Nobody could touch Sebastian Vettel and the Ferraris. But then the rain came, and it changed everything. And for some reason, both the Ferrari and even more so the Red Bulls, they just couldn't perform in those wet conditions. And of course, Lewis Hamilton and both Mercedes cars were able to turn it on when it really mattered in those slippery, damp conditions, cooler conditions as well. And it made the difference because they got the front row locked out, and that was what enabled them to then control the race and Lewis to go on and win it. I think actually it would have been a very different story had it remained dry all weekend and Ferrari managed to get on the front row with Seb, or pole position. I think he would have then disappeared off and controlled that race and won it pretty comfortably. So the rain was the thing that really swung it back in Mercedes' favour. Anyway, when we had the race itself, we still got some little kind of details of controversy, didn't we? We got the incidents between Valtteri Bottas and Sebastian Vettel, Bottas and Ricciardo. There was a bit of all sorts going on. A couple of pit stop errors, a bit of some mixed up strategy decisions. So certainly enough to keep my interest. I hope it was enough to keep yours. I didn't think it was a dull race at all. In the end, it's ended up giving Lewis a considerable advantage as we go into this summer break that everyone's so desperately craving. Right, Q&A Monday, of course. Thank you very much again for all of your questions. Roll the sting. Right, here we go. Pablo Rodriguez says, do you think Bottas was used as a support driver even though he may not have been aware of it? Well, yes, he was in yesterday's race. And that's not because Mercedes consider him as a number 2 driver, but he was in the situation, less so about the championship, but more so about yesterday's race. He was in second place of the 2 Mercedes drivers, and the lead car in most teams will always get the preferential strategy treatment on the day. So they'll get first call on when to pit, first call on which strategy they want. The second car will always have to react to what they do. That's the way most teams work. That's how they keep it fair. So that's what happened with Bottas. Actually, I think Bottas and Kimi were both kind of used in that role yesterday. So it leads kind of into this similar question from Gareth Brennan, who says, why did they stop Kimi so early? Was it ever going to work with all that traffic? The fact was that Ferrari were trying to use Kimi to tempt Bottas into an early stop. So they brought Kimi in very, very early. That meant there was a threat of an undercut to Valtteri Bottas, which potentially, if they didn't cover that, could have allowed Kimi to get in between the 2 Mercs and then set together a charge against Lewis Hamilton. Merc had to really cover that to be able to maintain track position and to be able to maintain their 2 drivers at the front of the field, controlling the race as they did. So Kimi was sort of sacrificed a little bit to try and tempt Bottas into that early stop. Of course it worked, and then they had to do it again later in the race because it was too much of an ask really to get him to the end, as they found with Valtteri Bottas towards the end. So it really was a game of the 2 teammates trying to back up their championship contending teammates over the course of the Hungarian Grand Prix. Sudesh Pandey, I hope I've pronounced that one right, says, why did Ferrari pit Seb when he got through the back markers but still had such good pace on the softs? They could have safely pitted him a few laps earlier as well. It's absolutely true, and you know, when you really analyse the way that Ferrari played their strategy on Sunday, I think you could say they could have made that made life a little bit easier for him. Whether he'd have been able to challenge Lewis, I don't know. But the fact that he, had that slight problem with a pit stop that cost him about 1.5 seconds, and maybe a couple of seconds actually on the pit stop, and he came out probably around about 1.5 seconds behind Valtteri Bottas after his stop. So first of all, they'd cut it very fine, allowing them no margin for error. And yes, lots of people said, well, he had a big gap over Valtteri a few laps earlier. He could have pitted at that point when he had a bigger window. He could have done, but Ferrari, of course, at the time were looking to give Seb the shortest stint possible on the fastest tyres at the end of the race to enable him to go after Lewis Hamilton. If he'd had a longer stint with a few extra laps to do on those tyres, he would have run out of performance towards the end of the race, where they really wanted him to be chasing down Lewis on a much, much faster tyre towards the end, giving him an opportunity to not only close on him, but of course get past. As soon as you start to extend that last stint on those tyres, you compromise the possibilities within that strategy option. So that's why they left it as long as they could. The problem with the pit stop was unfortunate. It looked like the guy putting the wheel on just either got the wheel pegged, which is when the little studs or the little pegs on the wheel go kind of head to head against the grooves on the wheel hub. So it didn't slot perfectly into the holes, is what it looked like. And then the guy putting the wheel on let go of the wheel, assuming it was on properly, and then the wheel gun man couldn't get the wheel done up because the threads weren't engaged on the nut. So combination of little tiny errors, but that's all it takes in these modern era of pit stops. So yes, you can analyse Ferrari's strategy. You could probably say they could have done things differently, but of course hindsight is a wonderful thing. Will Horizons says, do you think F1 should consider dropping the rule that forces teams to use both tyre compounds or 2 tyre compounds in the race? I don't actually know. Do you know why? Because I love the strategic element of Formula One. And I think if you were to drop that rule and say, even if you sort of mandated a pit stop and said teams have to come in for at least one pit stop, but they don't need to run a different tyre compound, you kind of just, you take away a big strategic play that's available to some of the teams. I 100% think we should be thinking about tweaking some of those rules, like the whole starting outside the top 10, we get free choice of tyres. I think there's perhaps room to tweak those kind of things, because you almost get some teams looking for P11 on some occasions, because starting just outside the top 10 but with a free choice of tyre can often be seen as an advantage. But no, I don't think we should be dropping the rule. I think that the idea where, a bit like in yesterday's race, where Seb started the race on a different tyre compound to the rest of the field, or to the rest of his competitors, looking for a different strategy, looking to force a play where he would come strong at the end of a race on the faster ultra soft tyre. And look, it could have worked if things had gone slightly differently for him. I think if you take that away, you just lose what can be on occasions, not always, but can be an added sort of element, strategic element to the race, which I think is important. Tom Powell says, what does the summer break actually mean? Do teams shut down entirely, and is it monitored by the FIA? Well, yes, pretty much they shut down entirely. The regulations say that teams have to close or stop work for 2 weeks, and they have a 3-week window in which they can choose to do that. So they can either stop work immediately after the Hungarian Grand Prix, or they can go back to work for a week, and this is what most teams do. They'll go back to work for a week, and then they will shut down and everyone will go on holiday for 2 weeks. And then they'll come back and they will get ready to go off to the next race. This is something that's come into the regs in recent years. It's not policed officially in terms of having an FIA representative at the factory doors to make sure they're locked. It doesn't happen that way. This is very much a sort of self-policed type thing. Formula One, I guess, as an industry, is big enough now that if somebody were to carry on working, I think it would be difficult to keep that secret. It would come out somewhere. So, plus, of course, everybody actually really does enjoy having 2 weeks off, particularly after the stint that we've just had with all of those races coming thick and fast. So it's something that's generally embraced by most people. There are certain rules about communicating with each other within the team via email. So there are a couple of little details you must adhere to in that respect. And there are also kind of caveats to the rule that allow the teams to open up the factory to do maintenance, for example. So if you need some of your equipment servicing, like a wind tunnel, for example, which you're not allowed to use during the summer break, but you are allowed to upgrade the systems or to have it serviced or to have it repaired or cleaned, or those kind of things can still happen, and it can do that without it costing you valuable working time when the season's kind of up and running. It's actually been something that's been a really nice addition, because when you've been working so hard, you do need a break. And if you just were to take a couple of weeks holiday, and you know, most of you guys will know this, if you take 2 weeks holiday from work, everyone else is still working, so you're still getting bombarded with emails, and you go back to work with an inbox that's, you know, got 1,000+ emails in it. Well, in the F1 shutdown, everybody else within the industry is off work, so you don't come back after the 2 weeks with an over kind of you know, absolutely clogged up inbox. It's quite a nice way to do it, actually. So it kind of works, and it's very well deserved, and it's actually the only real time when everybody really is able to actually switch off. Of course, you can keep thinking. Designers can be sketching in a notebook on a sketch pad. There's nothing to stop you doing that. If you've got an issue, a problem, the engineers can be thinking about that. They can be working things out at home, you know, but the reality is that most people actually want the break, so they take it. Kishore Kaffel says, how do you get rainwater out of a cockpit from a wet race? It's quite a good question. Well, actually, the reality is that when you're in the build-up to the race, on the grid, for example, when the car's stationary, you'll do your very best to stop the water getting in. So you'll have an umbrella over the cockpit generally to minimise the effect of any rain going inside the car. Once the race gets underway, you'd be amazed how little water actually goes into the cockpit at 200 miles an hour. You know, the aerodynamics of a car are such that you don't want the airflow rushing, being sucked into the cockpit opening, because it wouldn't be efficient. So everything's actually geared up to passing the airflow over the cockpit, around the cockpit, and off towards the rear wing. And that's the way, then, therefore, that the rain follows as well. So you don't have a huge amount going in, and I guess whatever water is in there at the end, it's just a simple case of using paper towels or whatever you can to get it out. The worst thing is if a car breaks down at the side of the racetrack, and of course at that point it just gets abandoned, and then it really can fill up with water. Van Archie says, can you explain how FOM passes work? The different types, what do they mean? How are they granted to each individual? Well, there are a number of different types of FOM pass. In fact, there's quite a few different types. I mean, I dread to think how many must be issued at every single Grand Prix. And there are lots of different criteria for having one being granted to you. So obviously the teams will get a certain number themselves, and even they will get different types, because, for example, the mechanics, the engineers, will have something that is a PLAT, pit lane all times pass. They tend to be orange. That means, as it says, they can go into the pit lane at any time. Because there are certain restrictions that the stewards or the marshals at the racetrack have to adhere to in allowing different people into the pit lane at different times over a race weekend. If you've got a pit lane all times pass, though, you can go in and out whenever you like, apart from, of course, being in the garage during the curfew hours, but that's slightly different. So the teams will have that for the people who are working on the car. There's also different passes for the marketing side of a Formula One team. They won't be allowed in the pit lane at all times. You know, there are media passes. In fact, I'll show you mine. That is mine. So that is a pass, which is a permanent pass. So that will get me to every single race in the 2018 season. It gets me into the pits, but only during certain times. So I can't go into the pits during qualifying. I can't go in during the race. So that also, actually, if you look closely on that one says starting grid on the lanyard. So that allows me onto the grid before the race. So I'm very privileged to have one of these, and I know that, and I think everybody who has one of these in their possession should feel very privileged, because not everybody gets one that has a starting grid access. Those numbers are very limited. This is obviously a media pass because I'm working at the races for Sky Sports, a media organisation. But Sky are a TV rights holder, so as part of their deal, they get a certain number of passes within their allocation for the season. If you are an individual writing for a magazine, for example, you can apply on your own through your magazine to get a media accreditation to a certain race. And there's different criteria you need to fulfill to do that. Your magazine, for example, needs to have a certain circulation number. And each application will be assessed on an individual basis to see whether it fits those criteria. And of course, there are limited numbers for every race. So lots and lots of different types of passes, all sorts of different colours. There are ones that only work in the paddock. There are ones that only work in the TV compound. There'll be others for the paddock club up above the pit lane. Of course, there's the pit lane. There's the starting grid. There are FIA passes. There are marketing passes. There are all sorts of different passes. Contractor passes, which again will be different. They all get you into different places at different times over a Grand Prix weekend. But as I said, I'm very lucky, very privileged to have a permanent pass, which will get me pretty much most places with that over the course of a race weekend. So very, very lucky boy. In fact, you can see on the back of here the places that it allows you. So commentary box, the control tower, I don't know if you can see these, the TV compound, the media centre, and of course, as I said, the pit lane, paddock, and starting grid as well. So I'm a very lucky boy. James F. Morgan says, are the F1 team's garages sorted in terms of their position by the rankings of last year's championship? Well, the first answer to that is yes, they are. He says, why don't the champs get the pit exit end of the pit lane? Because the pit entry always seems like a disadvantage. Well, actually, they normally do get the pit exit, and it changes circuit to circuit. What they do is they give the champions from last year the biggest garage or the best garage or the garage that may have an advantage. And that can change slightly from circuit to circuit. More often than not, you'll find it is pit exit, but actually it can be pit entry, as it was at the weekend. And pit entry is not necessarily a disadvantage. Either you get a very straight run into your pit box, whereas you don't have to swing around the previous team, which most other teams do. So most other teams will have to go past the garage next to them, swing in at a very tight angle into their pit box and stop on the marks. Well, if you're the first team, you can come in very long and straight and just have a very straight run in. Equally, when you're leaving the garage, if you're at pit exit, you get a straight run out of your pit box. You don't have to weave out past the team in front of you and then back into the fast lane. So both come with an advantage, and it really only depends on the layout of the circuit as to which end it goes to which team. But it will always favour the team that were champions the previous year.